Welcome to Portals of Perception and to Current Openings. What the world doesn't quite get yet, a conversation where David Price Francis and I dive in the current of this moment to discover what is opening. David, welcome.
Thank you, Aviv. Good to be with you again. Great to see you.
Well, this is Current Openings episode 24, and our working title is The Elevation Phenomenon, or The Elevation Mystery, or The Mystery of Elevation, one of the above. We're going to find out.
Okay.
In Current Openings 20, we focused on the Epoch Mystery. In Current Openings 21, we described the Conductivity Mystery. And then we spontaneously came together to do 23 and 24, where we developed an appreciation of the problem of describing how knowledge is being sourced, number one, and number two, how is it being validated and authenticated. And in this process, we developed a five pathways to describe the natural validation of life. And in the aftermath of that, we felt that we were going to double down on the first of those five, which centered on creational logic. We said, we're going to spend a whole year bringing to life creational logic. And then we said, well, actually, there is one thing we need to do before that, which is we've got to attend to psychospiritual and energetic hygiene. Because once we're going to go deeper into creational logic, it will unleash greater levels of power. And it will be useful and important to show up for that with a greater degree of intactness, wholesomeness, and readiness, having done some work into what I'm at a high level describing as psychospiritual and energetic hygiene. And then we said, well, actually, before we do that, this entire journey felt as though we found ourselves inside a new elevation. And so how about if we describe and explore this idea of what is an elevation, and also in the process of doing so, come back and take the next layer of what we attended to in Current Opening 16, which was about octave leaps. So that much I would offer as context. Anything that comes alive for you in the placing of it inside the flow of what I'm describing?
I think that dynamic of vertical, well, there's so much, but the key feature to me is energetic connection. That is that when we are working with creational logic, as we're making our way toward and working with on the way through, it brings with it greater energetic potency, and we'll need to explain that and get into what that is. And today we're looking at some of the side effects of that and some of the transformational nature of that. And of course, now we know much more clearly that the human is an energetic machine, if we want to use that language, that our brain is working on energetic signals, electrical signals, they're passing through our nerves. So we're wired, and there's different levels of power that can pass through that wiring. So we're looking at transformational change and an actual change in the potency that flows through the wiring. So that's kind of what I'd go with.
Yeah, well, it's always great when you have no idea what I'm going to show on slides, and you kind of seed the very final note of the conversation right at the beginning, because essentially you're making the point that elevation is to do with energy and energetic influx and energy what we want to do is unfold the journey. So let me bring the slides, and we'll play badminton with this, and tell me if you can see that all right.
I can see that clearly.
Okay, very good. So indeed, the process of elevation and its phenomenology, the elevation phenomenology. And one of the key ideas we left current opening 16, where we talked about the octave leap mystery, was that we decoded this idea that a lot of the time, the octave leap will not happen in a void. There is a situational, environmental context, and often the quickening and the energetic elevation shows up in function or in service capacity. In other words, you find yourself in a new higher octave, elevated octave, because you have dedicated your life to support, to enable, to facilitate some other purpose, and it has picked you up. So in many ways, what we're doing today is we're journeying backward to describe the layers that you must go through to actually actualize that. That's one additional context. And the other is, so this is the slide we arrived at in the previous two episodes, okay, 22 and 23. We had a catch 22, and then we liberated ourselves into 23. And essentially, this was where we landed with the 5 pathways, the 5 ways of validating knowledge as part of the integrated search for truth and knowledge, enabled and supported by the natural verification of life to mean what is showing up through the natural organic process of life to validate what we do, wherein we can bring science and spirituality and philosophy and arts and all the various different disciplines, sustain their unique differences and give them a place inside a larger whole. And what we said was that number one, we could study and validate that through the natural laws, and I added this time creational logic, because that's what we said we will do to describe natural laws and how the universe works, and the whole person orchestra engaging in a living application. So I'm bringing this slide to also say that what we are describing today as elevation and the state of being elevated is actually seen through all 5 of those, especially and certainly number 5, where we talk about the enhancements of the visible and invisible realms, the way the world and the universe respond to you and validate you in your endeavor. That's going to be central to the story and the decoding we are searching to access today when we talk about elevation and what are elevated experiences and elevated domains and how do they come into play in the human journey. That is the substance of each of the 5. Each of the 5 is a validation because it offers access to elevated possibilities, to elevated enhancements, to elevated capacities. So by way of bridging from the last 2 journeys, the 22 and 23, into this 24 episode, anything that you would say to this before I lead us into the inquiry indeed of vertical versus horizontal learning? That's where I'm heading next as a foundation. But anything with this content as a bridge from the last conversation to today?
Again, there's so many parts in this working together to create the whole. I would go simply with the title at the top of that slide, the initiation of the universalis human, and the idea that an elevation is possible. So if, let's say right now, primarily we could say a planetary human, then universalis human is talking about some kind of elevation into to be kind of extreme, a new model of human or a new level of human capability and process. So I think I would highlight that as kind of the overarching um, journey of elevation that is being pointed to here. Yeah.
Yeah, a very important comment, David. So, in terms of historic context, we can offer that the seeds of a universalis human have been with us for centuries with unique individuals that demonstrated unique capacities and capabilities. What we are asserting is that it has become a proliferated, democratized, and distributed access point that's appearing with many now called and described in different names and different language. And our assertion and part of the current openings, the bigger context is we are describing this time, which is an end of an epoch, a beginning of a new epoch, and possibly the developmental and transformational journey of the next 1,000 years. And what is it that we can contribute at this time for generations to come as they will step into more intensified conductivities, therefore also greater challenges, and therefore they will need to do the development work of stabilizing those new elevations and working with all that comes to take away or interfere or disrupt those dimensions of human life, as already seen all over the planet. A lot of the struggle and the strife that we see in many places can be seen inside the context of what we're describing. So with that, I will now go into the elevation mystery and its study and ask what is vertical learning and how is it different from horizontal learning, okay? And as we contemplate on this question, also, how does vertical learning and development facilitate elevation? Now, this is where we're launching this conversation. So let me offer a simple definition, then invite you to make any comment you want to bring to this, and then I will offer for instance, a story, an anecdotal experience that differentiates horizontal and vertical learning. Horizontal learning, in the way I define it, is simply learning by extension. You learn a new word in the dictionary, you added one word to your vocabulary. You haven't transformed your entire vocabulary. You've used one word, although if it's a very potent word and it begins to be used and get integrated to the everything that you formulate in your core ideas, then what was an extension of your vocabulary horizontally can produce a lift that offers some vertical potential, such as, for instance, now, today we're bringing to life this idea of elevation from a word into a living, multi-layered, multifaceted actuality. When a person decides to take that, the prospect of elevation, and do deep work into it, the word which initially was added to the vocabulary as a horizontal learning can unlock vertical learning, especially as we will go through 10 different natures or overlays of the process anatomy of elevation. So that's what horizontal learning is, an extension. If you never been to a country and first time I traveled to Sao Paulo, to Brazil, just arriving there was horizontal learning because I arrived in a place that I've never been to before, but I wasn't yet transformed instantly. Vertical learning is when I've been able to access greater depth with something I've been grappling with for a while, or I processed and metabolized through a certain domain of knowledge to a point where I was able to, it unlocked for me a new altitude, a new elevation. So either a deeper depth or a higher altitude, in the process of which everything that was in me before about that domain or even about life at large, because of the new elevation, it gets transformed. So extension in horizontal learning, just expand where you are. The vertical move transforms you on the inside, and you're not quite the same when truly vertical learning has been integrated. So let me pause here and see what that brings up for you, either by way of example or by way of experience that you want to bring this to life.
I think to come at it, to further open it up, particularly for the listener, with the idea of vertical learning, horizontal learning, to think of it like an east-west axis, because we're used to working with dimensionality of geography. So you've got your east-west axis, and then you've got your north-south axis. So an elevation would be going up toward the north in a sense, and that would be moving toward that idea of an octave leap. And then going south would be going more toward the idea of an octave drop or a quantum drop. You know, quantum leaps are popular, quantum drops not so popular, but it's the idea of it's actually a fourfold system rather than simply, as you say, extensionalism. I was looking at the language as I often do, and I noticed the word extension, if you change the letters around, it says next noise. It's like it produces the next noise, but it stays on the same flat um, on the same flat plane. So we get the word like stasis, which I think of as stay as is. So the ingredients kind of stay as the person stays as is, but they've added more as they're sitting in their armchair. They haven't caused a change of state internally. But the north-south axis actually brings about a change of state. So I think the idea of the different axes can help.
Well, great to not write our friends in the southern hemisphere as an octave drop because they will not like it.
All the way up with it.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and also to recognize that there is unique potential that's locked in the southern hemisphere. That
Yeah.
that is perhaps at the moment largely lodged in the unconscious of humanity because it seems that the northern hemisphere
Yeah.
leads culture in the conscious sense.
So
So
Let me make a correction then, because I'm talking about, let's call it the human axis,
Okay.
not the planetary axis. That was by analogy, but not at all to be applied to the state of the planet. We don't want everybody rushing to the north because that's not going to make a difference. What it is, it's inside in a way, it's the human axis. I'll put that with it. Yeah, it's a very good point.
Indeed.
so the for instance to describe that is the first time I traveled to Shanghai some 15 years ago to lead a large leadership summit with 80 managers from five different countries, in one of the leading Silicon Valley companies. And so when I just arrived to Shanghai for the first time, that was horizontal learning. Obviously, I read about it before, about the city and the place and history and all that. And it was the first time for me in China. I then been to China uh, again since, but this was the first time. And I experienced horizontal discovery of a new culture, of a new place. And then when we came to the leadership event, on the second day, I went through a piece of work that I often used to do with teams and continue to do with teams, where we go through the three pillars of trust and codify how in organizational success, when we bring to life these three elements of trust, we're able to accelerate everything in terms of organizational alignment and effectiveness. So we completed that piece and we went to lunch break. And I went with a senior leader, sponsor of the event, and he said to me the following. He said, Aviv, you've just given us powerful language about trust. If there is a way for you to somehow enable us to make the next step and embrace the behavior of it, you will do us a great service because you will truly offer us a launching platform to a whole new way of working and collaborating and working through our struggles and our disagreements. And when he said that, I got shivers down my spine because I knew I was in the presence of a portal into a new elevation potential. And we arrived to the lunch area. I just had something for 5 minutes and went back into the meeting room because I needed to, I had like literally 45 minutes to figure out how was I going to apply and respond to that. And I started walking in that place and a whole vision turned up, which I then proceeded to implement when they came back from lunch, which was that I gave birth to a new modality. And I brought 4 chairs in the middle, 80 people sitting around, round tables, and the 4 chairs in the middle, and guided them through a behavioral modality that enabled people to make requests to each other and proposals to work through differences, and provided me a behavioral theater to intercept them mid-sentence and to offer new language, to bring to life the way of acting high-level transparency, high-level trust. So several things happened. It became a breakthrough moment for the entire event. And I also actually accessed a new elevation in my work. This modality, then over the last 15 years, I've brought to hundreds and thousands of leaders with teams all over the world. And often people love this segment the most because the 4 chairs exercise in the middle allows us to dramatically accelerate whatever it is we're struggling through. So why was that vertical learning? Because by birthing this possibility, I discovered a way to then rewire the entire body of work. Because when you elevate in one aspect of your work, what it does, as you said earlier, it opens new set of potentials, energetic potentials, and actually you need to bring everything else that you do up to date inside the context of this new modality. So traveling to Shanghai was horizontal learning. The birthing of the 4 chairs exercise, which became central to the work I've done with teams over the last 15 years, was a vertical learning, vertical development, vertical transformation that in some ways rewire the work I'm doing. That would be an example.
Yes.
It's a great example. And notable that you mentioned the shiver that shiver that went down your spine as it happened, because that right there is that electrical current. Like, it's not by chance we call it current openings. You have to have a current to open up something new. So if there's going to be a new elevation, there's a current comes with it. And using kind of colloquial language these days, that's often called the idea of a download. But a download of horizontal learning just means more mass. But an actual download that has an electrical connection, that brings that shiver down the spine, and suddenly, what they often call the aha moment, something that is other. It's like almost a gift. It's like something comes through, and sometimes it takes an external trigger, like the person who was sponsoring the conference putting that question to you. Suddenly that opens, that triggers the response, and sometimes it's from internal quest. And one wakes up in the morning and it's like, or one's walking through a park during the day and suddenly something's there that wasn't there before.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that you put a magnifying glass on it because there are fine nuances in it. In this case, the shiver down the spine and the current appeared when the possibility was open, even before I knew before I had the mental translation. Sometime it indeed shows up already with the conceptualized mental answer, and so that current of electrical charge, energetic charge, it can reveal itself and can make entry through different portals of the human system. Which brings me now deeper into the main inquiry here, which is to begin to decode the phenomenology of elevation. And dimension number one is resistance. And what we have talked about resistance in a number of occasions before, including when we talked about the octave leap. And what we are simply asserting here, what I'm proposing, is that one cannot make an entry into a new elevated domain without needing to process and metabolize in some way through layers of resistance. And one way to appreciate it is to reflect on the law of enclosures. Because the law of enclosures asserts that each higher octave is surrounded by its antithesis. It sounds confusing. Why would a higher elevation, a higher domain be surrounded and enclosed with all that is antithetical to it? Well, it actually is the anatomy of ensuring that nothing lower in terms of intensity or purity or fidelity will enter that elevated domain, because what it means is that you have to metabolize through these layers such that you develop an interior formation that can withstand the pressure. Another way to describe antithetical is the pressure, the polarized pressure of whatever will come to prevent you, to stop you, to hold you back in actually attaining that actuality that presents itself as resistance. Okay, in the simplest way, if you are a performing pianist, the hours of practice is the resistance you need to metabolize through such that you can sit at the piano and play the Rachmaninoff third piano concerto. A very, very special piece. And without needing to think about even reading the notes, because you have now went through the practice of the resistance and the practice through that resistance, so you have attained that. So that would be the first phenomena nature that are described. What would you say to resistance and to why resistance is part of the journey to elevation?
I would refer right back to one of our early current openings and say that if one is going to be seeking to connect with something which is of a different nature than our basic planetary program, the existing programs will keep trying to occupy the entire space. So we meet the resistance of, just take the brain as an example. We build over time default brain patternings, which is a large part of the study of addiction, let's say. So we have these default patternings that are built in, and then they resist change because they're used to running and they want to keep running. So they offer a resistance to an elevation into a new octave. So to literally change our mind, which is an amazing human capability, to change our mind. Nothing else on the planet can do that. It then takes a certain amount of persistence. I notice you add the word P, the letter P to resistance, so you've got persistence. It takes persistence to keep at it in that regard, and not get swallowed up by what you already know. It's like the horizontal. Take that, the horizontal has a magnetic field that keep pulling you back into the existing plane. So the resistance is actually being able to let go to a large extent.
Yeah, beautiful. You have there in describing the habits and all that preoccupies you, you are already seeding the second, third, and fourth dimension that we're about to bring on screen. So the second is melting. Why do we need to go through melting? Is you've just given the explanation, because all those previous structures and the operating system you've used in the previous domain or in the previous octave, they must dissolve and they must be released, those habits, those systems, before or at least with and upon your entering of the elevated domain. Otherwise, it's like you'd walk into a living room of a very fine house directly from working outside in the mud. You won't do that. You would leave outside the dirty shoes. So in a similar way, you'd need to melt the inner structure that would actually produce friction and would would be antithetical to bring into the domain, which is the point we're making about needing to process and metabolize through what is opposite or resistant or antithetical to the elevation before you actually attain that space. What would you say to melting into the process of melting?
I'd look at the word solution. When you get a so-called knotty problem or a hard problem, we're looking for solution, which is liquefy. So we're looking to liquefy something. Like in business, when they're stuck with old stock, they'll have a liquidation sale. They're trying to turn the old stock into liquid so they can move in a new direction. They can't move the whole store in a new direction if it's still stacked out with old stuff. So they have a liquidation sale that then allows them to move in a different direction. And so the idea of solution and melting, they're closely associated. So to be able to solve something. Interesting, the alchemy idea was you'd have coagula, which was something coming together in a knot, or solve. So when you've got a knotty problem, you want to bring a solution, and that enables that. It will then help to enable the elevation. It's hard to go into an elevation carrying a store full of old goods.
Right. And it's hard to go into a new elevation when we are hardened. And so what you're saying, we've got to become more liquefied. We've got to become more of a fluid-like rather than rock-like, rather than fixed, as we seek to become accessible and available for a new elevation. And one of the immediate natures that appear with that is disorientation, because a moment earlier we knew where we were, we knew the perimeters of the domain that we occupied, and we had a good grasp of the ways and means and the navigation that was possible within that domain. But once we begin to melt the inner structures such that we become available and more liquefied, as you said, for that higher elevation to fashion us, well, one of the things we will experience is the degree of disorientation. Because again, letting go of earlier habits, letting go of earlier paradigms can actually create confusion as the terrain shifts and the rules of engagement change.
Yeah.
Well, we can see this on the outside and then bring it also applies on the inside. When we change the furniture on the outside, and even if you, very, very basic example, you get up in the middle of the night, you've moved the furniture around, part of you doesn't remember, pretty soon you're banging into things, even though you're the person that moved them. Well, that's in the external world. But what about when we change the internal furniture in our head and our way of perception changes? So with portals of perception, there's a shift in perception, and we're waking up in the same space that we were, but because our perception has changed, it's like a slightly different world. And if it's a radical enough shift, it can be a very different world. And so disorientation is a definite side effect there.
Indeed, so this is a very important distinction you're making there about the interior furnitures in our mind that enabled us a new perception, and sometimes the disorientation actually would trigger us to cycle back to the old perception. And that's exactly the point why we're going through these layers.
And that would take us back into point one, resistance, because what you
Right.
just described is resistance to that change in orientation.
And so what we're describing here, David, is not a linear step-by-step process. It actually sometimes few of these layers will co-arise and we will cycle through them more than once or twice. We're just mapping them in this decoded way, but this orientation, as you said, can act as a form of resistance. And also, it is the reason why the journey to a new elevated domain often involves uncertainty because of the nature of resistance and because of the alchemical melting process. What it does is it tends to introduce uncertainty because in actuality, we cannot move from one certainty into a new certainty just directly. It's in the way you describe moving the furniture. There was one settlement in the living room, and then you decided to shift everything, and you brought some new furniture, and it took a while for the new arrangement to settle down and to feel that that's exactly right. Similarly, when we shifted the interior furniture, what that describes is it describes the journey of stabilizing, which is some of the next layers we're going to get to, stabilizing in the new elevation. And what it also says is that the old attachments that provided us confidence and certainty, we must let go. We must relinquish those before we can truly be admitted or allowed in to the new elevation.
And we can certainly see that in the trace of human history. It's like when looking at an example, say, with Galileo, mapping out a new way of looking at the universe or the beginnings of that new way, and that then producing a disorientating uncertainty, which then brings about a resistance to those new ideas. And it's taken a long time for the old set patterns to melt, just working with those four together inside that example, actually. And even the uncertainty now as to the purpose and function of human life as our view of the universe gets to be larger and larger and larger and larger. Why are we here? What are we here for? It starts to wobble a little. It doesn't have the certainty of knowing exactly, being composed and saying, no, I know what I'm doing and I know why I'm here. Because the worldview is shifting around us.
I have mentored several younger people who went through medical school. There is always that phase when they go into residency, and they are not quite yet recognized as a fully licensed and proficient doctor, but they're already working as one.
Yes.
And that first experience when they either run the night shift and they are the authority, often surrounded by very experienced nurses, but they are the medical authority on site. So they're inside the new elevated domain, practicing it, experiencing, and then something happens and they actually need to perform the surgery or perform the procedure or respond to the emergency. And that is a journey that involves tremendous uncertainty because they know what they're supposed to be doing. They've been trained to do it, but now they're actually in the practice of becoming the very thing they've trained to become. And there is disorientation and there is uncertainty inside it, which brings us to the point of surrender. So the point of surrender is when you reach a point that it's no longer, well, it's going to be a nice idea to let go of the old ways. You cannot actually hold to the old ways as you have entered the new elevated domain. and where the disorientation, the uncertainty, they bring us to what I'm describing as the point of surrender, allowing the higher conductivity of the new elevation to permeate our entire being. So here is an example of this. In the early 2000s, I used to do a particular kind of work where I essentially developed leaders. That's what these companies paid me to do, to take their leaders on a often 4 days retreat to run through a program. And what I used to do is I used to generate a domain that I would bring them inside that domain of experience to afford them new self-insight, new appreciation of themselves, their talent, their core values, who they are as leaders, and essentially empower them to launch into the further development and growth as leaders. It used to have been exhilarating work, but it took a lot out of me. And I remember one day I was running an event late in the first decade of the like around 2008, 2009. I was running an event in near Lake Chapala, which is near Guadalajara, where I used to meet with teams in the Southern American countries that would gather there. And I remember on the last evening, I felt so exhausted, and I called Sarah, my wife, and I said to her, I have good news and bad news. And she said, okay. I said to her, I don't think I can go on doing this work. Right. I think it's taking too much out of me. And I also realized that this will not actually allow us to do the financial acceleration, financial velocity that will launch us into financial freedom. Now, I've been successful. The work was going great. People loved what I was doing. They always, every event sold the next event and so on and so forth. But I knew that I've reached a point of end, but I didn't see what was going to be the next elevation. So she said, so what are you going to do? I said, well, the good news is we're going to have to elevate. The bad news, I don't quite yet know how I'm going to do it. But what I do know is I do know two things. I've reached a point that I have to surrender for another process to pick me up. And instead of creating a domain and bringing these leaders inside a domain that I created, I'm going to have to go into their domain and help them re-architect what they do in their strategic work. And because of that, it will create even more impact on their business. And because of that, it will become more lucrative for them and will create for us lucrative possibilities. So she listened, she heard that with some uncertainty and trepidation because there wasn't anything certain. But shortly after, a client asked me to do that very work for them. So they paid me to find my elevated path to a new domain where I needed to rewire, which is going to be the next dimension, right. Dimension 6, rewire the work I was doing. The point of the story, in this case, sometimes you can make the transition without reaching a crisis point. I reached a crisis point. I literally felt like if I was going to continue to do this work, it was going to shorten my life rapidly. It was taking too much out of me. And so I reached a point of surrender where I didn't know what was going to be the next step. But that's where elevation happens. So the moral of the story, the decoding of the story, it truly is an uncertain path. And sometimes you need to leave a place of certainty before you know what is the next new elevation and the safety that it will provide you. Because unless you allow yourself to go through this kind of disorientation and uncertainty, it will not find access to you. In other words, you'd stay in the comfort of what you know rather than surrendering for a developmental transformation that takes you beyond what you have already learn to do.
Yes. Mate, that's beautiful. And takes you beyond what you knew you were capable of.
Indeed.
You've got a level of capability that is already established.
What else? Yeah. What else would you? What else would you say, David, from your experience, from your insight about how learning, how development works, and the significance of reaching a point of surrender, either by choice or sometimes screaming and kicking?
Yeah, yeah, uh, yeah. Well, example, being in Toronto in Canada and working to actually develop a large center, like it was a 22,000 square foot building, and all of what was involved in that with health departments and everything, came to a point where I was actually sleeping there overnight. It's because there was so much to do. And a similar aspect, it came to a point I thought, oh, I can't do this. And then what came was, yes, but it can do it through you. And that to me was like that moment of surrender. I had this conversation with a lady just last week because she was in a situation where she's gone as far as she feels she can, and she'd been part of. There was a time when there were conferences called "I Can Do It," and it was very popular conferences across North America, the "I Can Do It" conferences. And she's saying, "Well, I don't feel I can." I said, "Great, you've actually reached the point of breakthrough because now it can do it through you." So the fact that you can't do it is the mark of success because now you can move into the next elevation. And she's like, oh, and that was a real turning kind of moment for her because I've been there myself, having experienced that. And what does it mean? It can do it through you. It can sound like almost a bit woo-woo in its nature, but it's actually surrendering to the intelligence in our systems and the higher intelligence that can work through. And in the East, they talk about getting the ordinary I or the ego out of the way so that something higher can actually access and come through, which I think each of us has. It's built in. But to actually get through to the point of surrender, that is a cruciality. And yeah, so that in my experience does come very often with that kind of crisis point, which turns out to be not a break. Person is worried I'm breaking down, but that's the moment of breaking through. Break down would take us back into the lower, but break through and something else opens up and a new current comes through. And suddenly there's energy where there was no energy.
Indeed. And the reason we often need to find the point of surrender through crisis, is because we are creatures of habit, and also because we turn to love not only our successes but also our struggles and pains. We're not easy to let go, and so this entire focusing theme of the journey to elevation is a journey of learning to release, learning to let go, reaching the point of surrender, and reaching the point, as you said, where instead of you doing it, it begins to do it through you. Now, what is this it? Well, it is the latent intelligence. It is the latent potential that's locked within you and within the domain that you are servicing or facilitating or working to enable. And what it then does, it rewires you in its nature against its requirement. This idea that every domain, everything you're going to do has its requirement. And the reason this is so important is because, as we said, there is an energetic dimension to this. So once we begin to enter a new domain of practice, a new domain of knowledge, a new domain of artistry and mastery, what we are really describing is that the immersion inside this elevated energy space rewires and activates new internal pathways and connections. It's like the whole vessel that you are is rewired on the inside. As we said earlier, you wake up in the morning, you see yourself as this more or less the same person, but actually you are no longer the same person. Not only cellularly, you have re-updated yourself and rejuvenated yourself. Energetically, you have given birth to a new configuration, and it now works through you. So that's also why it takes time, because you can practice the third Rachmaninoff piano concerto for months and months and months, but there is a particular point with the greatest pianist where now I'm going to use the word now differently, where the piece surrender, where it surrenders to them once they surrendered to it, and it begins to play inside them. That's when you have been rewired in the image of what it is that you're seeking to facilitate. What would you say to rewiring from your experience, from your work with coaching and helping people go through the struggles of development journey?
Well, I have a colleague who said this to me when she retired from working in hospice. So she worked in palliative care for probably 30 years. And I said, "Oh, you're retiring." And she said very strongly back, "No, I'm not retiring, I'm rewiring." And I'm like, that's a very interesting statement. So we got into that somewhat. And she was deliberately taking up her love of studying the ways of the universe through astronomy, through astrology, discovering more about the stars. She said, that's a passion. And that's the passion that I'm with now. The other is what I'm leaving behind. I can still go there if I need to, if there's someone who needs my help, but I'm not going there in a full way. I'm rewiring myself toward this other passion of mine, what she thought to be a higher, a greater elevation. And she was very excited as she spoke about it. Now it's unusual, unfortunately, but to be speaking to someone and they're just leaving behind what they've been doing for 30 years, 40 years, someone's 65 years old, and they've got this passion about what they're moving into. That to me was a great example of that vertical process, that elevation. And we spoke just a little while ago, that was 5 years ago, and now she's getting more and more and more into the whole dynamic of the universe and the workings of the universe and what makes it all go and what's the mystery of the creative intelligence behind it. And she rewired herself.
So rewiring in this sense from a planetary function, a planetary service in palliative care to a universal orientation and bringing to it still the capacities, the capabilities, the sensitivities and sensibilities that were fashioned in the planetary role as she is attuning more to her universal possibility. So the rewiring then leads us to octave leap, and as we said, we've dedicated a full episode to octave leap, current opening 16. Oh, I didn't realize 16. Yeah, 1 and 6 is 7. This did we need another validation point that this process is smarter than we are? It seems to have its own intelligence. I just realized that. So we said a lot about octave leap. What I'd simply say here is truly the phase, the dimension of process where the new connections and all the work we've done to this point facilitate a leap into a new octave. And that what is a new octave, a new domain, a new elevation, it truly is a space where we are engendering a higher state of being. By definition, it means a higher state of energy. And that one of the unique natures that reveals themselves inside this is how do you know that you have made an octave leap? How do you know that you have elevated? Well, some of the work and the struggle that was involved in the previous octave disappears. It gets anesthetized. It is pacified. You no longer. I mean that is something that people experience through their life journey. One morning they wake up and they say, curious, I used to struggle with this thing and I no longer struggle with it. Well, that's right, you've moved into a new octave, you've moved into a new elevation, and what used to have been a preoccupying struggle is no longer there. Now, maybe it's no longer important because you have updated your set of values inside the new higher domain, or whatever it was that you were trying to work out has been worked out and has been resolved either in your interiority or in the cosmology around you. All of the above can be part of the anatomy of an octave leap. What would you say to this dimension 7 here?
To pick up on what you just said, though, the fact you said about working it out, like we go for a workout and we're working things through our system and away so that we can be with we can be in a fresher, newer energy. So we work things out, we don't work things in. Just a small point on the way through. But when we make that octave leap, we are then exercising out that which does not belong, and it comes, as you said, with a pacification. And it also has that nature of we hear a lot about quantum leap. I know we said it back in the episode, but that feature that a quantum leap is accompanied by a new energy. So when there is to be literally a quantum leap, a change of state, there's always a new incoming energy to help cause that to happen or to cause that to happen. So simple example, you put the kettle on the stove, you turn on the heat, and it seems like not much is changing until all of a sudden that input of energy into the water actually causes it to bubble and steam, and then you've got a genuine octave leap or change of state going on. So we have multiple changes of state which come to us automatically. So a good example would be that of puberty. And that's a real change of state, which is which when you've moved through puberty and you're 16, 17, 18, you really no longer got the same concerns you had when you were 6. And that is pretty much an automatic, because none of us, it happened upon us. None of us reached out and said, today's a good day for puberty and press the puberty button. We actually, it came upon us and we adjusted to the new state. Well, as we move into later in life, we're more able to be creating those new states through transformational change. So we can take a more voluntary part. I suppose a big example would be going from planetary to universal. There's a change of state. Maybe universal puberty.
Right, right. And indeed, when you moved through puberty, certain concerns were alleviated, and you now have new concerns. And
Sure.
and when you go through universal puberty, there are concerns that were alleviated. You're not so worried, perhaps, what other people think of you, but you're more concerned with what is it that in the universe that you are connecting to. And what we are proposing is that when we went through the resistance, the melting, the disorientation, the uncertainty, to reach a point of surrender, to get through the work of rewiring such that we experience the octave leap, with the octave leap, there is the special enhancement, special abilities, special capacities, special permissions, like in the case of you have now become a licensed doctor, so you have permission to practice medicine that you didn't quite have before. So there is in that enhancement, in that sense, to your capacity. That's in the realms of practicing medicine. We're broadly speaking here about how when you attain higher domains, higher elevations, your capacities will be enhanced in a special way. And what that means is that you're truly able to access this higher domain, and it brings special enhancements. It activates, for example, greater versatility, greater resilience, greater brightness, and all sorts of latent capacities. As you said earlier, you discover what you can do that you didn't even know was latent or was possible for you.
Yes. Well, I've worked quite often with energy healers in my practice because being energy worlds, I've had various energy so-called energy healers, even working to discover what that means, come to me. And one of the fundamental things is if you're going to be an energy healer, there has to be an energy that can heal. I mean, it's the most fundamental feature, but that is a special enhancement because so many healers were asking me, why do I get sick?
Hmm.
And it's because they were working with their own energy. They're getting to the place of running out of the ability because they're using their own energy. So by the time they've seen two people, three people, they're exhausted. And so the advice then being, well, how to connect to the journey, how to connect to a higher energy so that it can do the healing through them. And it's not them using up their own internal energies and then working with them to find ways and means to help do that, which includes what we're going to. That idea of energetic hygiene is definitely part of it. Um, and also how to do specific what can you say to make specific callovers to endeavor to connect with a higher energy source. So rather than I can do it, it can do it through me, that idea. And those are the people I know who've had continual success and can carry on doing effective energy healing work. So that's an interesting dynamic in relation to special enhancement.
And it also describes the what we're codifying here as number 9, the acclimatization work. Because what acclimatization talks about, so we've been rewired, we've made the octave leap, we are sourcing, connecting to higher sources of energy. We discovered that no, you actually don't need to work by yourself on your own to do healing. You can be a vessel, a conduit for healing to work through you. You can let it do the work through you. You're still involved. You still need to do your own maintenance. You still need to bring yourself up the bar so that you are in your optimal space. You still need to do the learning and the discovery. You still need to do a lot of work so that you are truly a good ambassador, a good conduit for whatever domain of connection that you have summoned to work through you. And what you need to then do is you need to do the acclimatization such that it recognizes you to be truly a, a, um, a, a fidelity source for it. Because as you stepped into increasing conductivity and power, and it required you to do the calibrated attunement. What you are dealing with, because you're dealing with greater intensities, greater power, certainly in the healing domain, a lot of your work becomes the what do you do before and what do you do directly after, such that you are a stable vessel rather than you go through a roller coaster. I mean, what we've seen in popular culture and in the arts, and why celebrity singers and performers often go a little out of balance or a lot out of balance, it's because they haven't had the guidance and they haven't had the discipline, they haven't had the practice of building a stable structure in the before, during, and after in their life. And that's why a lot of people reach not a breakthrough, but a breakdown, either a health breakdown or relational breakdown or integrity breakdown or any of the above, because they haven't recognized that so much of the work is the stabilization to fully embody the new elevation. I've tracked the same phenomenology with Olympic athletes. They just won the gold medal, and it's a known phenomenon, which is that they after the post-Olympic depression, because they've worked for 4 years to achieve something. They have achieved the golden domain, the domain of the elevation of the gold medal. And they went through the enormous resistance of building the preparatory system in themselves to reach that point, but they don't know what to do after.
Yes.
So if they are coached well, they will be educated and trained into the caught up syndrome and how to place certain markers of what they will have to attain after that achievement. The coach of the French swimmer who won a bunch of medals and uh, achieved extraordinary performance in the swimming pool in France said that the fact that there was one record he didn't break, I think it's the 400 IM, is great, because that meant that he actually didn't complete all that he could achieve. He needs to work to achieve one more thing. And it's a very wise and experienced coach that would say that, because within the glory and the intoxication of the elevation of all that he has achieved, especially that the Olympics was in his homeland in France, Marchand, Leon Marchand, was gifted a swimmer of this time after the era of Michael Phelps. He now has one thing that he didn't accomplish. So he needs to acclimatize and he needs to sustain elevated performance over a long period of time. And with some of those elite athletes, you find that they were able to transfer the operating system of their work then into, say, a business or entrepreneurial pursuit or speaking role to inspire others. Those were examples where somebody found a way to channel everything that they've done in their Olympic career into a next domain, in this case in service of other people often, inspiring and talking to next generations about the work. When they do that, that serves as a stabilization factor for them to sustain in the higher elevation. I know you've worked with many people that needed assistance and support in that aspect of the journey of elevation.
Yes. I tell one story. It's not a direct client, but just to move to a different domain, the domain of dance. Famous dancer Isadora Duncan, and she got inspired to go to the Parthenon, which was not at that time there were not so many people going to these places on the planet, and she started to dance, and she started to discover new movements. And she actually then started to move into a kind of dance that was new. Um, and she was inside that. So there was like a current. She was inside a current of something, possibly from ancient Greece, but she was moved to go to the Parthenon to dance. And this was the interesting part to do with acclimatization. She was able to hold that connection, but then it moved into demonstrating it to others and beginning a kind of a dance school. And gradually the weight of the attention upon her gradually caused that connection to recede. And then her life did move into a breakdown, as we know. But there's a process there from that initial connection and how it came about through an unusual dedication from between her and a particular place. And it was like the dance dropped in, is how she just, well, she didn't use that language, but the dance came upon her.
Yeah.
Interesting language, it came upon her. And then when it came to passing it on, the essence of that, the power of that gradually diminished because of the weight of what was coming towards her. So acclimatization and then being able to hold the state.
Yeah. You are describing also the phenomenology that we attended to in the teacher's journey and the guru trap. And what happens when the counter-transference of the projection of the people that you either teach or adore you for your performance, when that validation becomes larger than the validation that you have initially received from the communion with the source that inspired you. That's a very, very critical turnaround and somersault we need to attend to when we speak about acclimatization and then holding to the elevated perception and capacity. I mean, we are a YouTube channel. We would love for thousands of more people to find us and to find the work. And at the same time, I remind myself every time I do this that the greatest validation is the work itself and the current of the work. Yes, when more people receive the work and they find in it source of inspiration for their own life, it's great. And I would love that very much. I am also very much attuned to the trap of subjecting yourself to the validation of other people as the deciding factor of what you do. So elevated perception and capacity, well, we are talking here about what is ultimately the experience of elevated domain. It's the place where perception and capacity elevate and expand, culminating in a higher state of being, a higher state of connection, higher and deeper kind of more fully imbuing understanding and presence. And all of those are different natures and expressions of truly the elevated state. So I bring this to this point with also asking you to we looked at the entire sweep through resistance, melting, disorientation, uncertainty, surrender, rewiring, octave leap, special enhancement, acclimatization, and the elevated perception and capacity. You could probably write other dimensions here in the anatomy of that, and we've said a lot about why and how they are part of the cosmology of this experience. What else would you say about why are these elements integral to elevation, and how do they enable the connective siphoning of elevation? What else comes alive for you?
Well, it's such an interesting process between the individual's attempt to elevate, and then I think at this time, as you've called it, the time of epoch change and Homo universalis, we've actually got a change in the energies of the ecology in which we live. So there's actual energetic change happening around us. So we've kind of got two shifts happening at once. One of them is the individual shift, which is the attempt of the individual. And then there is this larger, I call it the great shift, which is to do with the shift in the energies of the planet. So both things happening at the same time. So we can expect the side effects to be greater now, and the need for integration to be greater now than possibly 50 years ago. So what does that mean? It means that that need for holistic change, individual change, to be moving into the octave to meet the octave change that I believe the planet herself is moving into. So if we're moving into a global octave change, we want to be able to be in an elevated state to meet that. So our elevated perception and capacity, our ability to hold special enhancement, our ability to literally handle the change of climate, as in terms of acclimatization, not physical climate, but more the energetic climate, the speed of the conductivity between people, which we've seen a ramping up enormously in the last 50 years. So
Yeah.
it's being able to be stable inside of, we can't handle change by staying as is. Stay
Yeah.
as is, like stasis. So if change is coming, we want to be able to be in stance and ready to meet it, rather like the surfer getting ready. The wave is coming and the surfer's already preparing the board. They're not just sort of lying around. They're actually on the move to be ready to meet the wave. So I see it to be symbiotic in that sense.
You've actually answered the third question, one that's not on the slide, and I appreciate and thank you for that. You've answered the question of why is this work, why is the work of elevation important at this time? And you've given a context to it from both the esoteric appreciation of the increasing acceleration and culmination of an energetic shift that is part of the epoch that's changing. And you've also given a context to it from the more exoteric realms, where we see that actually we don't find too many good examples of leaders on the world stage who are truly attuned to the leading edge. What we often see are leaders that are expressing the regressive reactionary cycle that always emerges when there is a new elevation that appears. So you could say that humanity is now going through a resistance and a melting and a disorientation and uncertainty because, for example, so much of the achievements of the modern world and what we have known to be the symbols and the emblems of modernity, they are melting and breaking down in various institutions. And if humanity is to find a way forward that is enhancing and peaceful and will unlock indeed this next horizon that we're describing in the Universalis prospect, then it will need to find significant transformation that would be expressed with new kind of leadership. Leaders that are able to hold and attain and hold in a stable way higher states of being, higher states of energy, higher states of consciousness. So to add to this a response to the question, why are these elements integral to elevation? Well, the simple answer we have attended to, which you addressed earlier today again, is because the universe is not one homogeneous soup, because there are different elevation, because there is a gradient where different systems and different domains have enclosures, because the liver is separated to the kidney, separated from the lungs, separated from the heart, because different domains have different functions, and they need to retain their fidelity and their integrity. And so in the everything that we do in the finer realms of elevated human life, we treat the realms we enter with tremendous care. We know that when you prepare for a scuba diving experience, you will get the right gear you need for scuba diving, and it won't be the same when you prepare for a mountaineering exercise. You will actually attend with tremendous care to the preparation, because as you prepare yourself to enter a new elevation on a mountain or a new depth in your scuba diving, that preparation and the practice, making yourself ready to building the staminas and the capabilities, is some of the resistance you go through to build and rewire yourself in readiness to be able to perform at the level that these domains require from you. So I have one more question to bring to our attention, which is why, or what is the difference between a peak experience and elevation? Because this is a doubling down on the importance of building the machinery to be stabilized with this new domain, making sure that it wasn't just a peak experience. What would you say to that? Because people have, I mean, you could say peak experiences are rare, but what is a lot rarer than that is actually stabilizing the peak experience and building an elevation that's sustained around that initiatory experience.
That's beautiful. Well, the elevation mystery and its study, the mystery is representing another elevation to move into. And when we're able to stabilize it, then we say someone has mastery. I think the mystery and the mastery is a very key domain here. Um, and we can have mastery of the octave that we have filled out, that we've actually occupied. But then there's the mystery of now what? So peak experience, I look at that as something which is coming out from, rather like the Olympic swimmer, coming out from what we already have and going at it as fully as possible, becoming what they call the goat, what is it, best, I forget what that means even actually, but best of all generations.
Greatest of all times.
There we go. So that's a peak experience. But then we get into something which is actually an elevation beyond the existing planetary program, because swimming is within the existing planetary program. And I think this is really fascinating when looking at, I was looking at the root of the word Buddha this week, thinking, what is that? I've heard Buddhist, Buddha, I've talked to, but I thought I'd never actually looked up what the root is. So I checked it. It was Buddhin, which means awake. It means awake and it means alert. And very fascinating how very often they'll show Buddha on a lotus leaf, or they'll show Buddha, and beneath him there's a spectrum, and he's in the next spectrum up. So he's managed to stabilize in a level above the regular spectrum of human life. And so he's called the enlightened one, the Buddha, but the Buddhin, the one who woke up. Um, and it seems to me when looking at world religions that they all seem to focus on someone who woke up in some fashion. So
Right.
they were in an elevation where they could bring something. And then that passes through into the human race and then gets brought into the regular domain of life. So the study of those that have gone before, I think, is a part of its study when you say the elevation mystery and its study. Um, and not counting oneself out. We don't have to look backwards and say, oh, they did it then. We're looking at the now and going, there's elevation mystery right now, looking for a home,
Yeah.
looking for where it can land. And there's no reason why any person watching this cannot position themselves towards that elevation mystery. And so to count yourself in is what I would be very encouraging about, because we tend to look at the great figures of the past and go, oh, they did it. Well, they had a human system just like we do. And it's possible in our time. It won't be the same as it was because the universe moves on. But there's new openings. There's new openings for new current to come through, and every person has the possibility of connecting with that.
So
And
that's,
when we read their story and the story of their journey, we discover that they went through their resistance and their melting and their disorientation. So for instance, here, I'm going to go a little bit off the reservation and share a mystical peak experience. And that would be an example of a peak experience that there's no way that I could have sustained, but it left an indelible impression with me. So that'd be a differentiation between a peak experience to a sustained elevation. I mostly read biographies. I find it to be the most interesting space for me in reading. And I've discovered that there are 3 ways you can read a biography. Anytime we say 3 ways you can do anything, you can anticipate that it will in some way associate with exoteric, mesoteric, and esoteric. So the exoteric way of reading a biography is you read the details of what the person did and where they went and what they said and what somebody else did back to them, and you collect horizontally the data points of what has happened in that person's life. And then if you attune deeper, and sometimes if it's a good biographer, they did the work for you, they attune in a deeper way to the life of the person, the inner life of the person, their sentiments, what they felt, what they experienced in themselves, and all the rest of it. And so that deeper mesoteric attunement in the reading of the biography is to the interior life of the person, not just to the exterior event. But then there is a third way of reading a biography, which is that you abide with the story of the person and you abide with attuning and sensitizing yourself to the interiority of the person, almost making yourself available to becoming that person for a moment in time, such that you can get to experience and feel the essence that motivated them, or the presence that inspired them, or the communion that awakened them, or the vision that they witnessed and experienced. So, and typically it's a different kind of reading. So I would sometime, when it's important, I would read second and third time. And I'm kind of not reading the details. I am reading the details, but it's a way for me to to abide with the person. And I did that one of the earlier experiences in this was more than 30 years ago. I was still in Israel, living in a little village in the north of Israel. And I was reading the Albert Schweitzer biography of Johann Sebastian Bach. And I read it and read it second time, and I stayed with it for months. And then one night, I've never spoken about this, and it will sound a little woo-woo for some, but I've had an experience that I can understand. I could rationalize, even on point. I had a lucid dream, and in that lucid dream, I was hearing a symphonic orchestral music. And in the state of the dream, I was informed that it was a manuscript. It was a musical score that was lost. So it was not part of the Bach body of work repertoire. And now I didn't hear and listen to all of his work, but I listened to a lot of his work. And I knew I was in that lucid dream hearing and experiencing a beautiful piece of music that was never played. And that piece of music that was birthed into life by him was yearning for expression. And even inside the lucid dream, I was aware that I don't have the faculty and the capacity to wake up in the morning and write it, which is, you know, there is the famous story about Mozart coming into the Vatican and hearing this piece of music that was never allowed to be played outside the Vatican up until the time the Miserere Mei Deus by Allegri. It's a beautiful, most extraordinary, moving piece of music. And Mozart, as a youngster, as a child, walked out of the Vatican and transcribed the music he heard. Now, not only am I not a Mozart, I don't even have the education to writing any piece of music. And I felt that in a way the piece of music wasted itself on me, because it should have lodged itself with somebody that would have the capacity to access it. And I remember myself in this altered state, staying and prolonging and playing through it one more time, and yearningly experiencing the grief that when I will come out of this state, there will never be any chance for me to reproduce it. So that was a rare moment of elevated state, a peak experience that, number one, I knew I can't sustain. Number two, I knew I won't be able to reproduce for the benefit of others. And yeah, it stayed with me for 30 some years. Never spoken about it, but it's an hour and a half into the conversation. So whoever stayed with us an hour and a half into the conversation, I'm all right to
They
tell
earned
you
the
things.
story.
What's that?
Earned the story by staying for an hour and a half.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
One
So
thing I wanted to say is the difference between peak experience and elevation. Where I was coming from, I realized was like slightly misaligned because I was coming out of peak performance.
right.
That the swimmer, that isn't so much a peak experience, that's more the whole dynamic of peak performance. So just to say that because what I was speaking of doesn't quite match what you were getting at there.
Yeah, yeah. I know. I was going into the mystical. Now, I do want to swing back into a practical note as the final move we make here by bringing this sense of practice and asking what practices facilitate the transformative, the vertical learning and elevation. And we've attended to these in different ways. So I'll quickly go through naming some domains and territories and see what you want to speak to, because it's a vast ecology of practices, and we could spend a whole episode on this, but we decided to codify this all as one recording. I'd say the first is inquiry practices, and especially what I'm describing often as permanent line inquiries. Permanent line inquiries are the inquiries that you live into on a permanent basis, like what I described on episode 23 in the second pathway, when you apply yourself to a domain and it comes to validate you. What that means is the inquiry line is so deeply lodged in you, even such that even when you do anything else, when you watch a movie or you are mid-flight in a conversation with a stranger, it continues to work through your unconscious. And when something shows up that's relevant for it, it will inform you. So that's the practice of dedicating and devoting your life. Like I'm producing this work on portals into the soul. I'm bringing to life in this some permanent line inquiries that I've lived with for 40 years. So they are active and conductive in me in a profound way. The second domain of practice I'll highlight is what I'll describe as connective, artistic expression and flow-inducing practices. These are the full range of practices where you lend yourself as a connective vehicle and conduit for something else. We talked about it just a little bit ago here in the context of healing practitioners, where you want to make yourself available as a vessel, as a vehicle to induce flow through you. So those a full range of practices, preparing the human machinery that you are, keeping it balanced, keeping it ready, on point, hydrated, rested, charged, and up to date with its needs. Doing all that work is part of the practicing life, the life of practice that makes you readily available for elevation. The third domain I'll highlight is everything that goes with collective, communal, and conversational modalities and practices. What we discover is, and again, I'm going to say briefly something that at some point deserves a full conversation. When you make an elevation, it's very rare that you'll be able to bring the whole of you to that new elevation. Typically, you'll make an elevation first through one aspect or one line or one faculty or one particular set of talents in yourself. And therefore, we are very prone when we make an elevation to have blind spots. Because in actuality, the anatomy of process is we have elevated in part of ourselves, but other parts are still behind. And so the importance of being part of a mastermind group or a communal practice or part of a system where we can reveal to each other, and like often happens in these conversations, I do the preparation, we have an agreement that you show up and you play badminton, and you will often bring to light aspects that I never considered. So there is something about that realization that in the elevation, you actually hold parts of the elevation that I need, that I yearn for, that I'm petitioning for, and that I can't access by myself. So when I'm with you, when I'm with a circle of friends, when I'm with a community of practice, we proffer to each other the aspects of the elevation that we couldn't get to by ourselves. So that would be the third domain of practice. The fourth would be anything that we do by way of experimentation, by way of disrupting and transforming habits such that we sometimes even trick ourselves into the unknown, to step outside of the comfort zone and to deliberately, instead of waiting for the point of crisis to squeeze us out of the comfort zone, to actually instigate a way of moving out of the comfort zone by changing habits. And you gave the example earlier on of is a development practice, which is you want to introduce a new perception, will come into your living room and move the furniture because it will produce in you the feeling that you've changed something in your exteriority, and that will invite you to, in the interior sense, also bring about a certain change of perception. And finally, which again we touched in a meaningful way in the octave leap conversation, is this recognition that anytime you take on a special endeavor, a special effort, as Gurdjieff liked to describe it, and especially with any functional service role, you're doing the work now not for yourself, not for your own glory. You're facilitating others. You are coaching others. You're working to enable healing in others. The whole spectrum of practices that are to do with that is also part of the life of practice that makes you ready to facilitate vertical learning and transformation and elevation. So I know I said a lot there. We could have chosen to create a whole separate episode for that, but I wanted to make that part of this one package about elevation. What's one or two things that come alive for you as I reflect on this?
That's definitely called persistence. Yeah. uh, it's that aspect of integration. That is to bring the different parts of us into cohesion towards what it is that we're telling ourselves we want, so that we don't leave parts of ourselves behind. So that when we're into the journey of real change, there's the learning domain we touched on previously. There's the aligning domain, and then there's when it becomes part of your actual basic constitution. It's like you've now got it at cellular level. Someone wakes you up in the middle of the night, and what comes out of your mouth is exactly the very thing it is that you're proposing to be and to do. So it's integrated through all the different what I call centers of energy. So this will be to do with that dynamic of the soul, but it's integrated. So it doesn't matter if you're probing into the body, into the mind, into the energy centers of the soul. They're consistent and they've got a cohesiveness. And that takes work to become an interesting word, colloidal, or to become an emulsion, which is amazing anagram. Emulsion says soul in me. So every part of us, the soul has to reach every single part, like the bloodstream. If it misses out one cell, that cell becomes necrotic. So for it to get fully permeated, that's really what I'm getting. And that then working with each of those practices, they'll combine to help create a fully permeated practice, becoming colloidal.
And the big message for me in this idea of becoming colloidal is something you've actually attended to and spoke to in several previous conversations, which is the idea of in the East of practice before enlightenment, practice inside the enlightenment, and practice beyond it. Why? translated into our context here, practice on the way to elevation, practice in the elevation for the sustaining of the elevation, and practice beyond that elevation to become available to next elevations, because that is part of the planetary deal, that we are inside the flesh, and even when we were elevated to profound states of communion and enhancement, we actually need to do the practice now, not to attain or bring about or fetch these connections, but so that we are actually sustaining ourselves in a stable place and making ourselves safe for the continuation of the work, which brings me to the final act of today and seeding the next body of work we're entering, which is, so how does creational logic play in this? And I would propose that rather than answer the question, I'm going to give an example, because what we've done in episode 23, we brought to life the natural laws as a validation pathway through the idea of a Trinitarian universe, the threefold principle, the triangle that shows up in all things. So if you bring that into the conversation, you'd say that one example is that the three core powers available to us are truly the capacity to say yes, the capacity to say no, and the third capacity to create a space that's beyond yes and no. I suppose you could call that space a space of plasma that that has a neutral permeating permission for all life to arise within it. And the way we actually work through those 10 layers of elevation that we described was, and I'm proposing in this example, is by the way we engage these three powers, by the way we say yes, by the way we say no, and by the way we simply make space for something to be what it is. And when we recognize that actually these are the only three things we can do in this life, the only three things we can do in this life is say yes to certain things, say no to other things, and then make space for certain things to grow inside us. When we realize that at the deepest level, we become a creational logic for elevation to work through us. And with that, I'm going to bring the last slide and then let you play jazz with both. And where that leads us to is the realization that, okay, elevation is not a destination, but a forever unfolding revelation. It's a process without an end. The notion of achieving, the notion of attaining, the notion of arriving somewhere, they all run counter to the very nature of transformative elevation. So the watch out in this sense is everything we talked about, what's happening in popular culture to superstars and celebrities and in sports and in the art world and so on. In these situations, somebody has been elevated by a large group of people, and they are now identifying with that elevation psychologically. They and project it back to themselves. And the identification, the identifying is the very counter process to the process of elevation. What elevation truly is the mechanism in the most universalized sense of it is how the larger universal permission reveals itself to human life. And the expression of elevation, David, as we know, is a shift of energy, is a shift of focus, is a shift of inner configuration. And the continual watch out, work inside is don't identify with it. You are still a fallible human. you've elevated to a new domain, and the next moment you're going to fall on your face if you don't watch it. So you once shared with me the kind of discipline that a person that walked on a rope when they crossed over the Niagara Falls, how they're focused always not where they are, but beyond. So they have a center of gravity that they won't fall. That's the kind of discipline, the kind of practice, the kind of stoic assimilation, stoic inner formation I'm describing, with a sense of surrendering for a process that never ends. And for all intents and purposes, we hope to arrive with that kind of process to the moment of death when we change form from this physical life to the next life, such that we can pick up the work on the other side. I don't know if we will be lucky. Sometimes the last few weeks, they can involve tremendous suffering and pain. But a wise person would think their way through to the point of their mortality and beyond, such that they engage with this process as the continuation of the revelation of life. So I said my closing words here, and I leave it for you to bring us home, please.
Well, I'm going to finish with a very simple concept. These graphics are beautiful, and that whole language just describes so much. So the journey from an id entity to a high entity. Never mind building your life, never mind building the id entity, the entity of id. The high, just change that D to an H and go for a high entity. And I'd leave that as a ponder. And that to me is a little kind of, for me, a link into that journey of transformative change from id entity to high entity. Yeah.
Well, thank you for, again, an exciting current openings journey, diving into the current, not knowing how it will unfold. And it's a work in progress. And what you just said there, that the need to become identified and build an identity is the trap of the development journey. That you want to achieve something, to attain something. And one thing we know is whatever we're going to achieve here by way of medals or financial or other planetary assets, we're not going to be able to take with us beyond the threshold of death.
We're going to leave it behind.
Going to leave it behind. So what is it that we may be prepared to leave behind now as we seek elevation while we're still in the flesh, in a way preparing, in a way rehearsing for that final elevation when we leave behind the physical body? Because in a way, one doesn't need to wait for the end of their life to die for certain things. One can die and be reborn into universal possibilities before one ends one's planetary duty.
Yeah.
And if there is something we hope to, this conversation perhaps inspire those who stayed with us here to the end of the second hour, then that would be part of that. Thank you, David. And we already know what we want to do next. We're going to be journeying into the hygiene, psychospiritual and energetic hygiene, and go deeper into creational logic. I think we just mapped there maybe the next half a dozen or dozen different conversations.
There's so much inside of today, the planning and preparation that you made there for. Yeah. It's brilliantly done. Thank you, Aviv.
Thank you. To be continued.
Okay. Hey, bye for now. Bye now.
Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.